What's up, guys? Welcome back, everybody, to another game review of the World Chess Championship match between the champion Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi, the challenger from Russia. Yesterday, we've seen quite an interesting game between these two players. Jan was white, and I will link this game somewhere around here above. And of course, today everybody was very excited to see what Magnus Carlsen, with the white pieces, the champion, is going to bring to the table. In previous World Championship matches, he generally started with the move 1d4. Well, let's see what happened in today's game. And he did start this match as well with 1d4 when he has the white pieces, the world champion. That is knight to f6, c4. And now Jan Nepomniachtchi generally plays the Grunfeld. He's a big Grunfeld proponent. He has played it all his life. A lot of his games are very dynamic, and he generally embraces this type of openings. The Grunfeld, the Benoni, he hasn't played the Benoni too much, but the Grunfeld specifically, that has been his pet opening for quite a while, for his whole career pretty much. In this game, he decides to go e6. This is the Nimzo, very classical approach, much more solid approach. We know that the Grunfeld is a very good opening. Nevertheless, white has a lot of ways in which he can pose practical problems, and I do believe that this is what Jan Nepomniachtchi and his team, when they decided what opening they're going to adopt in this World Championship match, were afraid of. Just being always tasked to finding solutions over the board. And in general, that's not a very good idea, and not a very good feeling to have over the board in a World Chess Championship match with so much pressure on your shoulders. You don't want to be under pressure from your opponent's opening preparation as well. So this is why they decided to take a much more practical approach, place the Nimzo Indian, which is rock solid, and just ask Magnus what he's going to come up with in this particular opening. And let's see what he came up with. Knight to f3, of course. If you go knight to c3, then that opens up the possibility of a classical Nimzo with the move bishop to b4. Knight to f3, d5, and now we've seen Magnus play knight to c3 quite often, and that generally leads to the qg-d, Queen's Gambit declined, or Queen's Gambit accepted if you take on a c4, or some Vienna stuff if you take on c4. But generally, black goes bishop to e7. They can go also c6. Knight b d7 has been tried recently as well. So in fact, black has a lot of options even after this move, knight to c3. But Magnus had something else in mind. Well, we have the Catalan on the board. The Catalan is a very complex opening, which leads to very complicated and interesting positions with very extensive plans for both sides. So both white and black have a lot of options pretty much at every single move for the next 5-10 moves. And this is exactly why I think Magnus and his team have decided to try to test Jan in case he plays this move e6 and tries for a Nimzo approach. In case they do go for that, this is what they're going to test Jan in, because it's so vast and there's so many options on the board. And let's see which option Magnus decided, and both Jan decided to go for. Bishop to e7. Now, bishop to b4 is another big option right now, and it usually leads to very complicated positions. After bishop to d2, now you can retreat back with bishop to e7, but a novel approach, not necessarily novel, but it hasn't been played that much at the top level. Nevertheless, there's one big proponent, and that is Sergei Karyakin. He played this move a5 recently in the World Cup against a player named Opardi, and he actually won with the black pieces. This bishop to b4, a5 is quite an interesting approach. It seems like Jan decided against it, and there's some rumors that Sergei Karyakin might actually be on Jan's team leading up to this championship. So we might see this maybe later on in the future if they continue to explore this opening in their future games. Instead of that, Jan decided to go with bishop to e7, which is pretty much the classical approach. Bishop to g2, castle, castle, and now d takes c4. This is pretty much the main line of the Catalan. Queen to c2. White is going to try to focus on regaining the pawn on c4. And right now, black has a couple of options. They can go with the move a6 and be ready to meet queen takes c4 with the move b5, immediately attacking the queen. Later I'm going to put the bishop on b7, and this actually gives black a very good position, very fluid position. I'm going to go bishop to b7, knight d7, followed by c5, breaking the center, and I'm going to solve my biggest problem in the Catalan, and that is the Catalan bishop. This bishop on c8. This bishop on c8 very often tends to be and remain very passive. So if black manages to activate the bishop specifically on b7, or as we see in the main line after a6 with a4, bishop to d7, this bishop heading towards c6. We've seen this quite recently in some high-level games. One of them that particularly comes to mind is the game between Sam Shankland with the black pieces and Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces at the recently concluded US Chess Championship. Position remains extremely complex, still within the opening phase of the theory. There's a lot more moves that these players have been analyzing in this particular main line. Nevertheless, the point remains the same. Black wants to activate the light square bishop, then potentially even give this bishop for this knight, and then stop this bishop with some sort of a pawn wall with this move bishop with this pawn on b7 and this other pawn coming to c6 and pretty much obstructing this light square bishop on the long diagonal. Very, very complex position. Instead of that, Jan decides to go for the second most played move in this position, according to the database, and that is b5, immediately defending the pawn on c4. The problem with this move, not necessarily a problem, but one of the consequences of the moves is that you're immediately opening up this long diagonal. Now, the main line generally at this point, for white, it goes with the move a4. a4 has been tried quite a few times, immediately hooking up this pawn, and we have a very complex position after the move c6, or even bishop to b7, which has been tried quite a lot at the top level and is considered to give black more or less a comfortable position, because after you take on b5, sure, you regained your pawn, and maybe you're even going to be very close to gaining another pawn on a c4. Nevertheless, I activated my worst piece, and I can continue activating it with the move a6. Nowadays, of course, you cannot take on c4. That would lose a rook. That would be very, very bad news. I'm attacking your queen and the rook at the same time. So the position after a6 remains very, very complicated. Nevertheless, it seems like black, with proper play, with the best moves, is able to equalize the position, which you want, especially in a world championship match. With the black pieces, you want to be as solid as possible. So I believe this is what Jan was getting ready to play if white would have followed the main line. But at this point, after the move b5, Magnus comes with the first big moment and the first big surprise of this match, I would say, and that is the move knight to e5. Now, why I'm saying this is a big surprise is because knight to e5 looks like a very natural move. Nevertheless, it hasn't been explored as much at the top level or at any level, actually. It's been played a lot online because it's the most natural move, right? You're just opening up this bishop, you're attacking the rook on a8, you're taking a square, a very nice square for the knight in the center. It feels like a very natural move. Nevertheless, after knight to d5, this is considered to be a bit premature, this opening of the long diagonal, because right now the knight on d5 cannot, if you want to kick it with e4, the problem is that you're closing up your bishop, but also giving me a potential square on a d3. So there's a lot of consequences if you try to kick that knight away from d5. Generally, this is considered to be quite a good position for a black, but Magnus had quite an interesting idea, and that is to play after knight to e5. I believe after knight to d5, the idea was to go b3 in the position, try to immediately tackle this pawn on c4, and after a takes b3, queen takes b3. Now we see this position in which white is most likely going to focus on this knight on d5 and the pawn on b5. So something along the lines of a4. And now, of course, if you try to continue defending, you're accepting a very passive position. This knight is not going to be able to go to d7 because the pawn on c6 is hanging. So a lot of things are happening. Black is still a pawn up. Black still has a very, very solid position. Nevertheless, it seems like white, especially in case of Magnus having analyzed this position with his team for countless of hours previously at home and in his training camps, he probably would have had quite a large advantage in terms of understanding and experience. So instead of that, after knight to e5, Jan started thinking, and he decided to play this move c6, which looks like, okay, what are you doing? You're giving me the pawn back. Sure, you would love for white to accept the pawn on c6, because after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, rook to b8, defending the pawn on b5. Now, pretty much all my problems have been solved. You still have a lot of pieces left to develop on this side. And also this bishop on c6 is a little bit far away from home. For example, if you try to defend the pawn on d4 with the move rook to d1, boom, I can trap this bishop on c6. I'm going to attack it next, going to force you to take on d5, and then I'm just going to have an amazing position. I have the majority on the queen side. I have a lot of space given to me by the pawn structure, and I also have complete dominance, especially on the light squares, after you will have to give me your light square bishop. So black at this point is doing amazing. Really, really good position for black. Of course, Magnus understood this. Not only that he understood this, but he probably had this prepared from home. So after the move c6, he decided to go a4. Knight to d5, immediately putting a lot of pressure on b5. Excuse me. Knight to c3. And now, this is another big moment in the game, because if you play a move, a natural move such as, let's say, a b4, well, now I'm going to go knight to e4, and you're going to have huge problems defending this pawn on c4. If I manage to get the pawn back, well, also my knight is already on e4, ready to jump to c5, take advantage of all the dark square weaknesses. I'm going to recapture this pawn on c4 back. I'm going to equalize the material, and I'm going to take this pawn on c4 back. The material imbalance, I'm going to take this pawn. I'm going to recapture this pawn back on c4, and the material balance is going to be restored. Nevertheless, I still have control over some incredibly important squares, that is one e5 and c5, which gives me the advantage as white. So instead of that, well, at this point Jan had to find a very concrete way of defending his pawn structure on the queen side, and he found it with the move f6. f6 generally is not a move that you want to make. There's a big content creator, Ben Feingold, that specifically says never play the move f6. Well, in this case, you actually had to play the move f6, because what you want to achieve with this move is kick this knight away from the center, but more importantly, give your queen this square d7, because after knight to f3, queen to d7, that indirectly enforces the defense of your pawn structure and this pawn on b5. e4, knight to b4, queen to e2, knight to d3. And I have a particular feeling that Magnus was still in his preparation at this point. Maybe this was the first moment when he started thinking. He played this move e5, bishop to b7, e takes f6, bishop to f6, knight to e4. Black is still a pawn up. Nevertheless, white is starting to get all his pieces towards the black king, but also potentially towards some weak squares. This knight jumping to e5, this knight jumping to c5. You still have to get rid of this knight on d3. Knight to a6, a very good move, reinforcing the defense of this square, but also potentially preparing a maneuver such as knight to c7 or knight to b4, reinforcing both the knight on d3, but also maybe thinking about getting this knight to d5. Just like that. Well, my arrows are not amazing today. Nevertheless, the idea is that you potentially want to get your knight to d5 as black. Knight to e5, bishop takes e5, and by the way, this move knight to e5 is a very critical decision by Magnus, because it allows this sequence with knight to c5, and it poses a huge question. Now, you have a couple of ways in which you can play this position. You can accept the fact that, well, right now, you're probably going to be material down for the foreseeable future. With this move, knight to d6, black has the option of taking another pawn on a4. This was played in the game, this position was played in the game, or play the move knight to b3. Another idea would have been to take on c5 and exchange a pair of knights. The problem is you no longer have another knight to jump to d6, which is the key square in black's position, and I, as black, have another knight to jump back to d3. So this seems to be giving black the advantage. I'm going to jump with a knight to d3, followed by the move c5, opening up this bishop, proposing and pretty much forcing the trade of the light square bishops, and then I'm going to have full control of the light squares. Also full control of the very important d file, because with this knight on d3, well, that will feel like a plug in on this d file and a thorn in white's position. This situation is almost an emergency situation for white. So Magnus decided, okay, it's time. We're playing a world championship match. Well, I have to take some risks at some point, and he jumped with the knight to d6, knight to b3, rook to b1, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, and after this sequence, we see black, well, an exchange up, an exchange and a pawn up. So it seems like from a material perspective, black is completely winning. Nevertheless, things are not that easy, because this knight on d6 is a tremendous piece, a tremendous force for white. Rook to b8. Now, if this exchange would have occurred on the board after c takes b5, the situation is quite dire. Bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, and something that you definitely don't want to see for white if you're in the world champion's shoes, you don't want to see this position in which, sure, you got your exchange back, but unfortunately all your dynamic compensation is gone. So black is just a simple pawn up, no compensation for white, and definitely great chances for black to take the full point home. Instead of that, of course, he decided not to take on b5. He's the world champion for a reason. He played the move rook to d1, bishop to a8, bishop to e4, and now a very strange decision by Jan. He played this move c3, giving up a pawn, which seems like it's almost for no reason. A much better move would have been the prophylactic g6. Why not? Just close up this diagonal. You know that white is trying to bring his forces towards your king. Close up the diagonal. Say, okay, what's next for you? You can take a pawn, of course. But the problem is, if you take this pawn, another reason and another consequence of this move g6 is that I freed this square for my queen. And maybe this was a detail that escaped the challenger, because after queen to g7 right now, black is pretty much in full control, because knight to d6 most likely would have to come on the board, after which I take on e5. This is the key pawn that gives white a lot of initiative. It supports this knight, but also supports a potential jump to f6 with a check. This pawn on e5 is extremely important. You're going to get two pawns. You got my b5 and my c4 pawn, but I got this central pawn, and after a move such as queen to h5, black is enjoying quite a large advantage. Unfortunately for Jan, he did not understand this nuance in the position, and he started with the immediate c3. And by the way, he played this move a la tempo. He played it very, very fast. So Magnus played the move. Jan was not even at the board at this moment. He came back, and after like a 30-second, 1 minute thing, he played the move c3. Queen to c2, g6, b takes c3. And right now, I think it was Jan's last moment in which he could have kept control of the position and kept an advantage in his pocket, but only with a very specific move. And I do believe that move to be a5, potentially trying to create this pass pawn with the move b4. But also, and this is another very important point in the position, another very important detail in the position, which is not easy to understand, you're making some space for your queen to go to a7. So for example, if white continues with the move h4, try to expand on this side, try to create some more weaknesses in black's position, and of course open up this big important crucial diagonal for your attack, well, I can just simply go with a move queen to a7. Not only that, I'm getting my queen off the d file, but I'm also creating an attack. Now, your queen on c2 is tied to the defense of the pawn on f2. This creates a very interesting dynamic in the position because your queen is overcharged. Well, what does that mean? It means that it defends too many pieces. It defends this pawn on a4, but it also defends this pawn on f2. So one of them is most likely going to be lost, and I'm going to take on a4 next as black. It seems like black's position is dominant at this point. So a5 would have been, in my opinion, a very, very important move, very beautiful move, and probably would have given Jan a large advantage. Not only that you want to create this pass pawn, but quite important that you want to get the queen to a7. He missed this opportunity. He took on a4. Queen takes a4, and now it seems like Magnus is getting slowly back into the game. Rook to d8, rook to a1, c5, queen to c4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, and now we see how important this pawn on e5 is. Not only that it supports that knight on d6, but also it supports the knight to go to f6. Give some unpleasant checks. King to h8, knight to d6, comes back, rook to b6, queen takes c5, rook to b8. Black is trying to exchange a pair of rooks and potentially start his attack against the king on g1. So what does Magnus do? King to g2. That's a very, very beautiful maneuver by Magnus. Unfortunately for black, they cannot go queen to c6 because after queen takes c6, rook takes c6, knight to f7 check, followed by rook takes a7. This is going to be a preferable endgame, despite the fact that black still, on paper, has the material advantage. Is going to be quite an unpleasant position due to the fact that you still have a huge weakness, the pawn on e6, that I'm going to be able to target once I redirect the knight to g5. But also after the rook lands on a g7, your king is pretty much going to be cut. It's going to be very, very passive, which is going to give me as white a lot of opportunities for an attack against your king. So white simply after knight to f7 in this endgame is better and probably would have been a very difficult defense for the challenger. After king to g2, Jan decides to protect this pawn with the move a6. Now queen to c6 is a threat because at the end of this exchange, my rook on b6 is going to defend this pawn on a6. So what does Magnus does? King to h3, shielding away the king from this check on c6, rook to c6, queen to d4, king to g8, c4. Do not let white play the move c5 and solidify even further this knight on d6. So black goes queen to c7, taking away this square c5, queen to g4, that is a consequence of the move queen to c7. You're leaving this weakness on e6 unattended. And now Jan decides to simplify the position. I think this is the practical decision with time ticking down, move 38, still a couple of moves until time control, time ticking down. This is probably the best practical decision that you can do as black. Simplify the position. You know that you're going to be a pawn down at the end of all of this. Nevertheless, the position is going to be very simple. It's going to lead to an endgame. The next sequence of moves is going to show that, which technically and theoretically is a draw. Jan knew that. Jan calculated and decided to take on d6, take, c5, take this pawn as well. And now we see massive exchanges. I'm going to take on a6. White is going to be a pawn up. Nevertheless, after rook to f8, not only that, I'm attacking this pawn on f2 twice, so you have to make a decision. You have to defend it somehow, but also I'm supporting this trade of queens with a move queen to f5, which came on the board. And this is just a technical draw. Both players know exactly how to make a draw in this position. As black, as the defending side without a pawn, it's not difficult. It's not a difficult end game, and the next few moves just showed that. Rook to a7, king to g8, king to g4, rook to b5, rook to e7, rook to a5. Now we see a bit of a shuffle. White is trying to take control of the 5th rank and try to invade with the king. Well, you're not going to be able to do that, because after king to g5 potentially is going to be met by king to g7, and this is exactly why black put the rook on the 7th rank, defending any sort of checks. You're not going to be able to kick that rook away from the 7th rank, and the position is just simply a draw. White plays h4, king to g7, h5, trying to create some more weaknesses in the position. King to h6, king to h4, rook to a1, g4. Let's give some checks. Rook to h1, king to g3, take on h5, g5, rook to g1, and now both players were understanding that the position has simplified irremediably, and the game is going to fizzle out into a quick draw. Rook to h6, rook to a4, king to f3, and now just a couple of checks.